What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, I remember the Southern strategy. That was something that we go back to the Nixon era when he really learned that Republicans were ascendant in the South. And many of us heard it in terms of coded words like law and order. And that was really a big part of the 1968 campaign with Richard Nixon. But I'll tell you, the history of this is so fascinating, and it goes back to 1948.
Wow.
When Strom Thurmond walked out of the Democratic Party and started the Dixiecrat Party on his own. And then, of course, he became a Republican later, deciding that it's better to win elections than arguments. And he joined with Richard Nixon in reversing a lot of what Richard Nixon stood for in the 1960 campaign, because they both learned from Barry Goldwater in 1964, if you're going to go fishing, go where the fish are. And the fish, in this case, were Southern men who were taking the bait about a lot of the coded words that the Republican Party was starting to use about what another Southerner, Lyndon Baines Johnson, did to elevate the civil rights movement. It was really fascinating to learn a lot about this in a conversation with Angie Maxwell. She and Todd Shields wrote a book called The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics.
Wow, I hadn't realized all this. This is new to me.
Oh, absolutely. Believe me, there is content in this podcast that you have never heard before. Now, I think a lot of people know that the South used to be Democratic.
Right.
And a lot of the resistance to the civil rights movement came from Southern Democrats. And you're still hearing echoes of that in this campaign as Joe Biden says, well, I had to work with those guys and we got things done and I'm not afraid to really reach out. And so he got himself into trouble at the beginning of the primary campaign when he was talking about making accommodation with Southern Democrats, if you recall.
I do remember that. He really got him. He really got into hot water.
But there aren't any Southern Democrats any longer, in many ways, in office when you look at it. Though, of course, Mr. Jones beat Roy Moore in Alabama, which was a stunner. Right. But it was because Mr. Moore had so many problems in his past that it couldn't be avoided. But with all of that said, we think of Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon, of course, I was stunned to learn from Angie Maxwell that, in fact, he ran a campaign based on civil rights in 1960, because I don't really recall that, but he was from California.
Right.
And then in 1968, quietly, using various words like law and order, he was sending a signal to the South that while there have been all these changes in civil rights laws, don't worry, I'm not really going to enforce them.
Wow. See, now I see a lot of this stuff went over my head.
Well, all of us, really, John. But there's so much more to the story. I mean, I gave you a little bit of the backstory.
You need your decoder ring here.
Yeah, you really do. Absolutely. What was his name? Buck Rogers. Yeah, we need a decoder ring. But what she tells us is that that was only part of the Southern strategy. That's why the book is called The Long Southern Strategy.
Wow.
But it brings in women and their role in the South, feminism, the Equal Rights Amendment that has never gotten passed, and it also brings in the evangelical Christians and how they have been added, making this a three-legged stool, and the long Southern strategy continues.
Wow. Politicians don't usually think that long, which this whole thing surprises me. Usually they're, hey, what's hot now? What can I jump on? They don't think long term.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was up on YouTube just the other day, and I was listening to a professor. You know how when you're going for some content, and now you've got a 2 or 3 minute commercial, and oftentimes you'll listen to 10 seconds of it and skip the ad and so forth. This one was really interesting. It was a professor from Gettysburg College, and he was talking about how the North won the war, but in many ways lost the peace. And I had never really put that into full context, that losing Abraham Lincoln right at the end of the war was so seminal to what happened after that in terms of Reconstruction, in terms of Jim Crow, and 100 years until the Civil Rights Movement. I had never really thought about how debilitating that was to the North, having lost a leader like Lincoln, and how different things would have been had he lived.
Wow. Yeah, you don't think about that. Well, you wonder about that with Kennedy, if things would have been differently, if we would have gone into Vietnam as hot and heavy as we did.
Exactly.
Exactly. I mean,
a lot of what-if history.
Ifs.
Well, this is not what-if history that we're going to be bringing to you in a moment. Angie Maxwell, a wonderful presenter from the University of Arkansas, and this is an incredible book. If you love politics and you want to understand American politics even to this very day and beyond, you have to read it. The Long Southern Strategy. Today on America Trends.
With us on the line on America Trends is Angie Maxwell. She is the director of the Diane Blair Center of Southern Politics and Society, an associate professor of political science, and holder of the Diane Blair Endowed Professorship in Southern Studies at the University of Arkansas. And along with Todd Shields, who is the dean of the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas, they have written this remarkable book called The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. And Angie, I'm going to ask you to go back just a ways. A lot of people might remember that a lot of the segregationists of the past, and I know Joe Biden is answering for this now, were Southern Democrats. And then, of course, a lot changed. The Republicans, well, since Lincoln, were thought to be the party of civil rights. And many of those supporters of civil rights, Republicans, helped to bring a lot of important legislation along over a long haul. But what happened to turn the South to Republican hands and develop this Southern strategy? Where did this really begin?
Oh, it's the million-dollar question. Well, as you mentioned, the Republican Party, of course, is the party of Lincoln and the party of the Union troops during the Civil War. And the South is solidly Democratic. And then, it can trace back all the way to the New Deal coalition after the, Great Depression. So many Americans, such an enormous percentage of Americans, had lost everything and such high unemployment rates that it allowed FDR as a Democrat, one of the Northern Democrats, to build a coalition that, looking at it now, you wonder how it was sustainable for so long. You had Southern white segregationists. You had African Americans, mostly outside of the South, who could vote. You had labor and the growing unions, members of those unions. You had the Jewish community. You had kind of some East Coast intellectuals, all together, but mostly because that's what we do in a crisis sometimes, right? In a crisis, people kind of come together. And so it was never going to hold, that coalition. But you didn't know if it would kind of fall back to how it had been, where, Southern Democrats and the Democratic Party is still the party kind of Jim Crow and all of that, or if it would change. And we start to see some shifts in 1948. So after FDR has passed away and Truman has, ascended to the presidency, Truman does a couple of really important things that shake Southern Democrats. He, by executive order, desegregates the military, which is, very upsetting to Southern segregationists. He also is the first president to give a speech to the NAACP. And in that speech, he's pretty adamant about, when he says all Americans, he means all Americans. And so when Truman gets the Democratic Party's nomination in 1948, which, most people did not think would happen. They didn't take him seriously. Several Southern delegates to the convention walked out. And they decided they were going to run a third-party candidate, and they ran Strom Thurmond under a ticket called the Dixiecrats. Now, the Dixiecrats, it was so close to the election, they weren't even on the ballot in every state. But the Dixiecrats really thought what they were going to do is that the Democrats would lose because they pulled off, and that would show the Democratic Party that how essential, Southern white Democrats were. This was their gamble. And as we all know, they lost that gamble because Truman is reelected even though it's slim. And so the Southern, Democrats are kind of in this purgatory of sorts. They feel like their party is moving away from them and protecting, Jim Crow. But they have no history with the Republican Party, hardly at all.
Right, exactly.
And very little Republican infrastructure. So there's this weird, decade where, Eisenhower, who comes in after Truman, of course, both parties wanted Eisenhower to run for them. I mean, Eisenhower was nonpartisan for the most part, and he runs with the Republicans, and he picks up a few kind of peripheral Southern states, but again, it's all just in limbo. And then in 1960, Richard Nixon running against JFK. Nixon actually, as the Republican, runs on this pro-civil rights campaign. Pro-civil rights campaign. But when JFK wins, it's Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, Republican, who says to his party, after JFK defeats Nixon, we are not, as a party, the Republican Party, we are not going to get the African-American vote. We're going to have to go, and this is his famous line, hunting where the ducks are.
I love that quote. And, of course, after that, we saw that the Republicans reorganizing in a way toward this Southern strategy and getting Nixon the second time in 1968 to buy into this. So let's start with the basic understanding that most of us have of the Southern strategy as we called it under Nixon.
Well, to understand Nixon, you have to go back to 64 and look at what he learned from Goldwater. So in 1964, the Republican Party is radically split over which direction they're going to go on civil rights. You have the Rockefeller wing, who is wanting to keep a pro-civil rights plank in the platform, and then you have Goldwater, who is in his campaign team, including Strom Thurmond, who has now switched his party to Republicans, saying, we really should play up an anti-civil rights plank. And that was to the dismay of a whole lot of Republicans. And when Goldwater gets the nomination, on his final kind of swing through the South, they called it Operation Dixie, he and his surrogates play up aggressively that Goldwater had voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which of course had passed just a few months before the election. And that ends up getting Goldwater 5 southern states, 5 deep South states flip Republican. Mississippi
Which
goes
would never have
Republican.
happened had he not
Never have happened. Mississippi goes Goldwater by 87%. 87% of the vote. That never happens, ever, in any election. So it's dramatic. But other than those 5 deep South states, those are the only, and Arizona, his home state, those are the only states Goldwater wins. So when Nixon gets the nomination in 68, there's real angst within the Republican Party about should they keep going down that path. Remember, as I said, Nixon had run a pro-civil rights campaign just 8 years earlier. And they're looking at what Goldwater won and trying to decipher, where it went too far. And they kind of feel like if they can hit this silent majority, they can kind of code the language, not be so overtly anti-civil rights, couch it in some language that, honestly, there's no other real way to say it, that, kind of let some of these Southern whites vote with Nixon without having to admit to certain, racist prejudice. Now, how many of them knew that was what the coded language was doing to them, is impossible to.
You say in the book that basically Nixon in 68, along with Strom Thurmond, traded political support for benign neglect of civil rights enforcement. And they did it in a stealth way, law and order, war on drugs. So they used all this code terminology that masked the true intention, or at least what they were really trying to say, and they believed many Southern whites would understand what they were saying.
They did. And I mean, now it's important to know that among the politicians involved, it was adamantly clear. I mean, when Nixon, there's kind of a late charge by Ronald Reagan at the Republican National Convention trying to get the nomination. And Strom Thurmond gathers the kind of early Southern, white Democrats that have turned Republican, like the kind of first wave of them. And he says, Nixon has promised he will not enforce the 64 Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act of 65. We have to stick with them. So they knew adamantly. But they also had George Wallace in the race in 68. And so Nixon knew that George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, running as a third-party candidate, he'd probably pull those hardliners, those deep South states, which he does. And so Nixon was trying to kind of thread a needle where he gets the rest of the South, right? And that's the story we kind of tell. We say Nixon plays this racially coded language, and the South turns, between 68 and 72, the South turns red. And it's kind of full stop. That's the story that we tell.
Well, you do tell that story, but you also really unpack so many realities that most of us, and particularly those of us in the North, don't quite understand. But I want to go back to a quote in the book. You say, when that power was threatened, meaning to Southern whites in terms of seeing the new opportunities that were being made available to African Americans through civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act and such, that power was threatened by the civil rights revolutions. They struck another grand bargain, this time with the GOP, the terms of which have yet to expire. So this is ongoing. That's why you deemed the book the long Southern strategy. And the strategy doesn't only revolve around race. And I think that's one of the key things that you deliver in this book.
It's true. Not only did kind of the short Southern strategy, the story we know, is incomplete in that it's not just, racial angst, white racial angst that was used to flip the South Republican, but also that the white racial angst, courting those white voters over that did not stop. It morphed into different kind of techniques and different topics, but it's been ongoing for the last 40 years and, even now. So it's that the racial, racialized politics continued and that it expanded to two other major, kind of cultural touchstones, which was the Equal Rights Amendment and then the role of, the separation of church and state, or the role of religion and evangelicals as voters.
Let's go back to talk about women first. And you say in the book that the ERA really was one of those dividing points where so many Southern women went back to a different approach using the term family values, anti-feminist, rhetoric. But you also tell us, and this is long part of the Southern past, about the criminalization of black men and the need to protect white women. And that had gone on, of course, historically. So put all of this together. It's an ugly kind of elixir, but it is part of the history of the South.
It's one of the things that, we just don't talk about, and it has had a major impact. The culture that Southern white women grow up in, and many of them have since the antebellum period, is this Southern white femininity that is kind of fragile, delicate, pleasing, stays out of, the public sphere, doesn't worry themselves with politics too much, or it's definitely seen as, a man's world. And that stereotype was kind of manufactured by, Southern white men to justify the need for segregation, the need for lynchings, even the need for slavery. In other words, Southern white women needed to be protected from these aggressive and violent black males. And so, white supremacy is kind of chivalry in that sense. Again, it's a cover that allows people to feel good about what they're doing or morally righteous about it or that it's necessary. It's that kind of faux justification. But what it does for Southern white women is it really kind of put them on a pedestal and kind of put them in a box. Now, a lot of Southern white women like that. Some don't know any better, but a lot of them like it, and others, did feel very oppressed by it and kind of broke out of it. But that has a cultural residue that still, exists today. So when the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a completely bipartisan effort, completely huge numbers of Republican women that are feminists, we do. I mean, to the point that, like, as I say, at the 1977 National Women's Conference, which was called to kind of galvanize support to ratify the ERA, both former First Lady Betty Ford, Republican, there, and the new First Lady, Rosalind Carter, Democrat, there. It was completely bipartisan. And then Phyllis Schlafly, an activist from St. Louis, Missouri, and a Republican, who had written an important book called An Echo, Not a Choice, that had influenced Goldwater, before Phyllis Schlafly really starts an anti-feminist campaign. And she would call it anti-feminist because she frames feminism not as choice, but as a mandate. So if the ERA passed, she told audiences, you will have to go to work. You will have to put your children in government daycare. You will have to serve on the front line, right? Well, for many Southern white women, this just crushed that pedestal, right? The ERA threatened it so dramatically. And so when Phyllis Schlafly organized a counter rally in Houston in 1977, she used the label and the banner family values, and Southern white women went on church buses and showed up there to, push to kill the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Republican establishment took notice because you got a crowd of 20,000 people. They start looking to see how they can use that issue and capitalize on that issue to solidify their base in the South. Because, as I mentioned in the book, even though we tell the story that Nixon really kind of flips the South red, the South goes right back to Jimmy Carter in 1976. I mean, right back, blue.
Right.
So if you're Republicans and you're thinking you're questioning your electoral map strategy. You kind of put all your eggs in that basket and it worked, but now it's gone. Like, what do? How do you rebuild those inroads, repave them? That Carter, as a Southern white, Southern Baptist, kind of born-again peanut farmer, right, had pulled back from you, being kind of one of them, one of these Southerners, right? And so they have to look for something else, and they have to adjust the racial argument, but they also are looking for another moment of cultural angst. And so...
Okay, so this is another plank in the long Southern strategy. That's what the book is called. Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields. Angie is with us. And the subtitle, How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. And we'll get up to the present because we see so many signs of this Southern strategy being nationalized, if you will. So we have the great white, anti-feminist, Christian switch. We haven't gotten to the Southern Baptist Convention and how moderates lost out to more extremists and where that all ties together in this story.
And a lot of it overlapped. Jimmy Carter being a born-again Southern Baptist, a lot of evangelicals that were starting to get politically involved. 76 is a little early, but starting to get politically involved. They have high hopes for Carter. And they're really disappointed by his administration because they think he's one of them, so surely he's going to, push for issues that they care about. But Carter was very separation of church and state, So they start looking for a way to influence not the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party, right? And this all goes along at the same time that the Southern Baptist Convention, as you mentioned, turns fundamentalist. So moderate Baptists were literally purged from the SBC. Women were kicked out of seminary that were in seminary. There was new doctrine adopted at the Southern Baptist conventions all through the 80s. And it really moves, to the far, right on gender roles specifically. And because of that, it makes a perfect tie-in with this family values argument. Now, when Bill Clinton, another Southern white male, Southern Baptist, starts to win Southern states back for Democrats again, which he does, and starts to pick up voters, the Republican Party really decides to double down on reaching to these evangelicals. And that's when you see in the 2000s gay marriage being put on the ballot in several states to drive the vote. You really see the rhetoric and language quoting scripture increasing. You see George W. Bush even frame our foreign policy in terms of kind of a Christian nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And this pulls evangelicals in, dramatic numbers. And that's when you finally see, when you hit all three of those things, right, you finally see a really solid Red South.
Interestingly, you say that at the beginning, those fundamentalists were really dealing with more moral issues in their minds about family values. But then they took everything that was cultural and colored all kinds of secular issues like the economy, climate change, terrorism. They were able really to get a much wider swath of political interests under the banner of religion.
It's absolutely true. I mean, it starts on abortion and gay rights and school prayer, and that makes sense to us. But what happens is that when Ronald Reagan won't go far enough for the evangelicals, some of whom kind of given Republicans a chance, they run their own person, Pat Robertson. And that's what Republicans start to get nervous about. They get nervous that they're going to break off. Like, how are they going to really keep these voters in? And then, of course, when Bill Clinton pulls some southern states back, they're very nervous. And so what they have to do is they really just have to turn them into all-out Republicans. And the way they do that is to make it not just about those kind of social, conservative, moral, religious issues, but to turn all issues into religious issues, right, in some way, shape, or form, in the rhetoric they use or in how it's framed as what the world will look like if they lose this, and to making them feel attacked, right? The war on Christmas, the Christian nation is threatened, that a lot of our efforts overseas are to protect Christians. All of that really transforms your social conservatives into all-out, Republicans.
And there are so many points along the way where people are made to feel resentful, well, as you point out in the book, which was one of the most brilliant statements I've heard, and I'm a poli-sci major going back many years, but the idea that equality isn't looked upon as a really good thing. When you're the group that has had privilege over the years, that means you're being brought down in your view. But there are so many ways that you can look at that, so many ways that somebody can use that to upset you, to motivate you, and such. And you point out in the book, and again, folks, I just want to tell you, anybody listening to my podcast and has listened to America Trends over the number of years we've been doing it, this is just a remarkable book, and you really do have to read it. But you point out so many things. For example, the movement turned to making social welfare programs look fiscally irresponsible. So that's another way to do it. Not the defense spending, but what was being spent to help ameliorate some of the conditions for those who have been kept down for so long. Or the issue, the final turn, where whites being victims of reverse discrimination. And it was pretty remarkable the way you walk us through all of these ways that political rhetoric can be used. So here we are today, and we're talking about the long Southern strategy. And we see such racial animus going on, particularly from the White House. And how does that play in to this long Southern strategy? Because you do say that Trump is by no means an anomaly. And even though he is not, terribly Christian, if you will, in much of his life's undertakings, he is adopted and he is embraced. Explain how we go from where we were in the story to where we are today.
Well, I remember right before the SEC, that's what we call the SEC primaries in 2016, the Republican primaries in the southern states, had a reporter ask me, who do you think will win Trump? And they just couldn't believe that. They couldn't believe, they thought Cruz. I said, you have to look at who's hitting all three of those buttons. And it doesn't, it doesn't matter if Trump has passes some kind of litmus test of his own Christian beliefs. When you turn social conservatives and evangelical voters into just all-out Republicans, what they care about is will he act the way they want him to act? Will he do the things they want him to do? Will he fight for them? Right? When you frame everything as a war on, then they want someone who is going to fight back. And so this is how you get a New York billionaire, millionaire, whatever, not religious, person, them seeing as their champion and hero. And the American, as the Republican Party made these choices, because there were always people in the party saying, don't go there. There's a lot of infighting in the party, saying, don't go that route. But as they did, the American people have sorted themselves kind of accordingly. And now the group that feels that way, either, they're Christian kind of nationalists, or they, anti-feminist, or they, want to protect white privilege, or they're all three, or a combination of 2 out of 3, they're the majority in the party. Not all Republicans, but they're the majority. And the nominee they get is going to, manifest those things. And it accounts for 95% of Trump's white votes, is holding one of those attitudes.
But right now, in the midst of a lot of the skirmishes that are going on rhetorically, he is so naked about this long Southern strategy and trying to nationalize it. I mean, what does that suggest to you? I know that you're a great political scientist and you focus on the South, but trying to bring that to the entire nation, particularly at a time when many of us look at the South and say, well, with a lot of the young people and with many transplants, the South is changing too.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this, because this book is about what happens to this country when the GOP decides to target those white voters. Because and they run a ton of data on this. The GOP was way ahead of the Democratic Party in terms of running data. It's not that those attitudes are exclusive to the region. Of course they're not. They're just in higher concentrations. It's denser, right? The number of people who feel it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't pull people everywhere. And so what the Republican Party didn't really just go south. It kind of became Southern. And it nationalized the worst part of Southern white identity, the worst aspects of it. And it picks up people all over the country for that. That's why you've got Confederate flags flying in Ohio and, in Iowa and all of these other places, especially if you can expand some of these issues like the racial other, right, to be immigrants, right, beyond just kind of the black-white dynamic that was such a part of Southern history and is still a part of Southern life, right? You can expand it where it relates to more people, then you absolutely nationalize it. It's also that it's the policies they took, but it's the way they did it, this Southern style, which was an us versus them kind of demagoguery, the big rallies that are almost tent revival-like, personality politics, which is all part of what Southern politics has always been. And that translates to new audiences nationally in ways that, I think have, hurt this country, dramatically by polarizing it. Now it's to the point that, Trump hits more voters in his party by running to the far right.
Well, you say, by definition, white Southern identity is rooted in opposition to someone or something. So you've got whites versus blacks, Confederate versus Yankee, capitalist versus socialist. So there's so many us versus them and team allegiance, a demand for total loyalty. So as you look at it going forward into 2020, where's the South going to play a part politically in this next race? We know that Virginia is up for grabs if it's the right Democratic candidate. Georgia, some have said, is beginning to move a bit. What would you say? Where are we headed in the South today? Give us the mix politically.
Absolutely. Well, if you look at the 2018 midterms, it's really two different headlines if you live in the South or if you live outside the South. So all those successes that women had and, more diverse representation, being in Congress, that did not happen inside the South. And what it points to, it came close in some places. What it points to is just how long rebuilding that Democratic infrastructure will take. I mean, the Republican Party didn't flip the South overnight, and the Democrats aren't going to flip it back overnight. It takes years of reaching to voters. The states that have the more diversity, more non-native Southerners, whites also have a much better chance of doing it. That would be a Georgia. That would be Virginia, maybe even Texas as that Democratic infrastructure, rebuilds. And it's also just is really important to remember that the number of people that hold these attitudes in the South, there are places where it's still extremely concentrated, like Mississippi, Deep South. But there's other places where it's being diluted by generational change somewhat, by diversity, all of those things. But even in those places, there has to be a party. There has to be voter turnout. There has to be an effort to rebuild and rebrand the Democratic Party. It doesn't just happen, kind of overnight. And so I look to those pockets and see that I think there is potential, for change, but it's not just going to be one charismatic candidate that does it, right? Because you can't get much more charismatic than a Stacey Abrams or a Beto O'Rourke or an Andrew Gillum in Florida, and they all came extremely close. It's going to take a long kind of Democratic Southern strategy back to appeal to the good parts of Southern identity, that sense of family, the sense of taking care of each other, the sense of stewards of the earth, all of those elements, and kind of seeing as a collective that will, I think, bear fruit.
Angie, let me ask you this. In your book, and let me quote, "Majorities may be made in that murk, but so too are myths that in turn obstruct the long view of the past, misinform the present, and misforecast the future." So help us not to do any of those things. For somebody who came into this podcast late or hasn't been as attentive as they should be, what do you want us to leave thinking and knowing about the past as it's informing the future?
And the whole reason I wrote the book is because if we don't see the long Southern strategy, then we suffer under the illusion of this kind of myth of post-racial, America. I mean, that sense of white privilege is very strong, and it takes real work and communication with folks like that to understand that, and a real education campaign. The second is that we have this kind of myth of the gender gap. We do not realize what percentage of Southern white women are very invested in the Republican Party. There is, Hillary Clinton wins white women outside of the South. Inside the South, she loses to Trump by 10 points. You have 75% of white women who would not vote for Stacey Abrams. So continuing for us to look and go, well, women are going to be pulled by a woman candidate. Southern white women, not the case. So we have to build different coalitions in those places. What about men who are working hard for women's rights? What about men who believe in that? Right? There are other groups that the Democrat Party has to really, appeal to. And then in terms of the social, I talk about this myth of the social conservatives, and I've heard this so many times. When are these evangelicals going to abandon Trump? Like, if they're so moral and religious, why are they not upset? because they are politicos, just like every other political interest group. They don't care what he believes and does in his personal life, or they don't care enough. Trump, literally, their support if he will do certain actions, right? If he will appoint a pro-life justice to the Supreme Court or something. And so continuing to think that the outrageous things that he says or that he's going to somehow offend, it just isn't the case, right? The Republican Party is not broken. It's exactly what they made it to be right now. And Republicans that don't like it need to work to take their party back, right? Or they need to consider voting Democrat for a while, or whatever they need to do within that party, because he is speaking to a base, and Democrats have to be unified, right? They have to be unified. The percentage of people who just voted third party in 2016 is dramatic. I mean, it was in 13 states. 13 states. The percentage of people who voted third party or a write-in or something was greater than the difference between the two candidates. That accounts for 155 electoral votes. 155. If Republicans can get behind Trump with the kind of unity they did after that primary race, Democrats are going to have to do the same. There's strength in numbers. And that's what it's going to take, whether it's the primary, the person who wins the primary is the candidate you loved or didn't love, right? That kind of unity is the only way that there's the numbers to start flipping some of these southern states back. And like I've also said, it's just, we just don't find evidence for the economy being the issue. Sometimes people think it's the economy, but it's not really folks that are suffering. It's folks that fear they will. It's kind of white voters who haven't quite fallen economically yet, but they are worried about it. And they are worrying about it because people are making them worry about it. The immigrants are going to take your jobs, or they're going to receive all these government benefits, and it's going to destroy, your own, pocketbooks and all of this. It's really this clinging to what they see as kind of a white, male-run, Christian nation, and one realizing that and thinking that it's all a zero-sum game, right? As if we can't all coexist.
Well,
right?
It's interesting
and
because I think now people can listen to some of the rhetoric that we're going to be hearing in this campaign, and the distancing of the others, and understanding why terms like socialist will be bandied about to make the other side seem totally unacceptable as an alternative. And you have to understand this, I think all of us, as part of what's been going on in the South for a long time. The long Southern strategy, how chasing white voters in the South changed American politics. We see it today. What an incredible book. Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields. Angie, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends.
Thank you for having me.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.